Sherwin joins us now live from New York to talk about, of course, these developments and more. Sherwin, reading that statement from U.S. President Joe Biden, certainly not mincing his words when it comes to the support that him and Vice President Kamala Harris are showing continuously towards Israel.
Yeah, and this is a support that has been demonstrated, Bongewe, since the attack by Hamas on October 7th. Very soon thereafter, President Joe Biden flew to Israel and says in the statement that you refer to that he was the first sitting U.S. president to travel to Israel during wartime. He continues that on this solemn anniversary, let us bear witness to the unspeakable brutality of October 7th attacks, but also to the beauty of the lives that were stolen that day. The October 7th attack brought to the surface painful memories left by millennia of hatred and violence against the Jewish people. But he also then talks about the fact that history will also remember October 7th as a dark day, Bongewe, for the Palestinian people because of the conflict that Hamas unleashed that day. Far too many civilians have suffered far too much during this conflict, and tens of thousands have been killed, a human toll made far worse by terrorists hiding and operating among innocent people. We will not stop in terms of working towards a ceasefire deal and, of course, a diplomatic solution to the expanding conflict we are now seeing across Israel's northern border with Lebanon. But not really offering many solutions. Yes, words of commiseration, words of sadness and regret given the circumstances of what has played out starting on October 7th a year ago. But all we are hearing is that the United States will continue to work towards a ceasefire, which is something we have now heard for months. The UN Security Council in June endorsed the Biden peace plan, essentially something that they told us both sides were ready to accept and agree to. And of course, that has not been implemented. What we have just seen is tragedy upon tragedy upon tragedy and failure upon failure upon failure in the international community in seeking to arrest the continuous tragedies that continue to unfold. Now you're seeing an expansive war expanding in Lebanon. You see a ground offensive. We have just seen reports that the Houthis in Yemen are firing at Israel. Expect another response against them. So we are on the precipice of something here and moving in the wrong direction in many ways as we mark this anniversary, Bongewe, and certainly not in the right direction.
And when you look at, of course, what you've just said right now and looking at some of the visuals we just played, these are visuals of Israelis who are marking the day. But at the same time, Sherwin, concerns are mounting by some of the ordinary citizens of Israel who are saying, what direction are we taking if the country is fighting on so many fronts?
Here's something we don't talk enough about, right? We don't know the conditions of the over 100 hostages. 101 is the number we use regularly now, but we don't even know how many of those 101 hostages are alive. What are the conditions under which they've been kept for 12 months? Underground, in tunnels, in Gaza. You've seen the devastation and destruction above ground. Who knows what that looks like underground? Do they have access to water, food? I mean, we're talking about a year into this conflict. What sort of access do their captors have in terms of providing them with food and sustenance required, right, to keep these hostages alive? So we don't know how many of the 101 are alive. And a number of the hostage families and some of the survivors who were released during that ceasefire in November last year. You remember that 1 week ceasefire that gave so much hope about what could possibly come here. They will be participating in an event hosted by the Israeli mission in one of the chambers here at the UN, at the United Nations in New York. A day of remembrance. There's also an exhibition that is opening up here at the UN, a photographic exhibition that will reflect some of the faces of the hostages, many of them unknown to so many around the world. And so a lot of sadness certainly here on the one side, but also a lot of sadness among Palestinians. They don't have any direction as to how this is going to end. And remember, if the war ends today, Bongewe, you are then dealing with an enclave that has been largely devastated. We're talking about 75% of Gaza having been destroyed. People no longer have homes to go back to. So even if this is day one of a ceasefire, there is still so much work to be done to build on a possible cessation in hostilities that the unknowns are still far greater than what we know today.
And these unknowns, Sherwin, as well as the escalating tensions, the humanitarian crisis, the hostages and everything else that we've seen in between, is also indicating to us that the parties are moving further and further apart, and thus the cessation as well as the ceasefire talks certainly making them very difficult.
What's interesting to observe is that there's broad consensus about what needs to happen next. There's no division between the United States and South Africa, for example, on the need for a humanitarian ceasefire right now. You saw in that clip President Joe Biden speaking at the UN General Assembly on 24th of September, talking about how that deal that they put forward in June of this year needed to be implemented now. There is also a deal, a temporary 3-week ceasefire being put forward by France and the United States between Hezbollah and Israel in Lebanon. That's a deal that needs to be implemented now. There is broad consensus in the international community. What you have is a peace and security, international peace and security architecture that is simply not shaped in a way that can address the concerns of conflict today. This is a concept, the UN Security Council, with its vetoes, that came after World War II. Those prescripts that were developed decades ago are just not meeting the moment. The US has a veto, Russia has a veto in Ukraine, China has a veto as it comes to the situation in Myanmar, or the DPRK. One can go on about different scenarios around the world. The point is, the Security Council needs to be reformed, and once that reform happens, countries need to uphold the prescripts of international law, which is another problem, right? The ICJ rulings have been handed down, binding provisional orders that have not been implemented. What have the consequences been? Nil so far. So the system's just not working.
And this is a UN Security Council, for example, that speaks about having different mechanisms in order to be able to deal with the challenges of the day.
And yet, when you talk about where the game is in terms of peace negotiations between Israel and Palestine, between Israel and Hamas, between Israel and Lebanon, where are those negotiations happening? They're not happening in the organ, the body called the UN Security Council that was created to deal with these kinds of situations. There are satellite talks happening in different capitals around the world, led by Qatar in Doha, the United States in Washington, Egypt in Cairo. Peace talks possibly, talked about in Geneva, but not at the UN Security Council. So you see that there's even a recognition by the parties involved in those negotiations that perhaps the Security Council in its current formation is just not equipped to deal with these situations. And so you have these satellite negotiations that happen where we're told something might be in the offing in the short term, but of course we're now into the long term, and that ceasefire deal has still not been delivered, raising the question, why did the Security Council allow that to take precedence when it has been the UN Charter empowers it to deal with these issues. So, these are part of these long-standing negotiations. There's a big relook that needs to happen in terms of how we move forward here. Because Gaza is not the only situation we are dealing with right now. If you look at the situation in Sudan, 2 generals that are now fighting for over a year, and the international community, the African Union, is unable to bring these parties to heal and to stop the conflict, and the humanitarian consequences are exacerbated. The massive humanitarian consequences, there are real questions to be asked about how the system has failed humanity.
Real questions indeed, Sherwin. Thank you so much for that.